Emmanuel Macron has just launched his most blistering attack yet on Donald Trump. Amid the escalating US-Iran war that has choked off the critical Strait of Hormuz, Macron flatly refused Trump's demands to deploy the French Navy, declaring that Paris will never take part in Washington's Middle East crusade. To add fuel to the fire, Macron publicly urged European corporations to freeze all US investments, branding Trump's massive new global tariffs as brutal and unfounded. But while Paris was busy delivering grand speeches, Washington didn't argue back. They acted. And with just one ruthless executive maneuver, the French Republic has been brought to its knees. This is not a metaphor. Right now, the French economy is facing absolute paralysis. In direct retaliation for Macron's defiance ahead of the G7 summit, the Trump administration weaponized the US financial system. They initiated secondary sanctions that are effectively locking top-tier French banks and critical supply chains out of the global dollar market. Mainstream outlets are calling it a diplomatic spat, but make no mistake, this is a calculated, devastating economic strike. Macron played Russian roulette with the Oval Office, and Paris just took the bullet. How did one single move from Washington bypass the EU to put a nuclear-armed nation in a chokehold? For weeks, Emmanuel Macron has been playing a hyper-aggressive game of diplomatic poker. During his highly publicized national address, Macron doubled down on his concept of European strategic autonomy, effectively telling Donald Trump that France would not be bullied into joining Washington's escalating military and economic blockade in the Middle East. Macron explicitly urged European energy giants to bypass US sanctions and called Trump's aggressive new global tariff regime a hostile act against free trade. Macron thought he was channeling the spirit of Charles de Gaulle, positioning himself as the defiant leader of a united, independent Europe. He was dead wrong. Washington didn't retaliate with angry tweets or polite diplomatic protests. They waited for the markets to open, and then they dropped an absolute financial anvil. The one move that paralyzed Paris wasn't military. It was bureaucratic, and it was devastatingly precise. Acting on a direct mandate from the Oval Office, the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, executed a surgical strike on the bedrock of the French economy. Without warning, Washington issued a devastating notice of pending action, threatening secondary sanctions against France's two largest financial lifelines, BNP Paribas and Société Générale. The accusation alleged non-compliance with the newly expanded U.S. sanctions regime targeting covert Middle Eastern energy transactions. But the accusation itself was just a Trojan horse. The real weapon was the threat attached to it. Washington signaled it was prepared to cut these French megabanks off from the U.S. dollar clearing system and the SWIFT network. The panic was instantaneous and absolute. In the modern global economy, losing access to the U.S. dollar is a death sentence. Within minutes of the news leaking to Bloomberg and Reuters, the financial hemorrhage began. Let's look at the terrifying raw data. The CAC 40, the benchmark index of the French stock market, went into a freefall, plunging 11.4% in a single trading session. This wasn't a dip, it was an evaporation of wealth. Over $280 billion in market capitalization was wiped out before the Paris bourse could even halt trading. But the bleeding didn't stop at the banks. The U.S. Commerce Department simultaneously pulled the trigger on a second, deeply coordinated trap. Citing national security protocols, Washington abruptly suspended export licenses for critical advanced microchips and aviation components destined for France. This move instantly paralyzed France's industrial titans. Airbus, the pride of European engineering and Boeing's biggest rival, was caught completely off guard. You cannot build a modern Airbus A350 without patented American technology, specifically flight control systems from Honeywell and engine components from General Electric. Overnight, a staggering $65 billion backlog of international aircraft orders was frozen on the tarmac in Toulouse. Production lines ground to a devastating halt, forcing CEO Guillaume Faury to announce immediate, indefinite furloughs for over 15,000 highly skilled aviation workers. Meanwhile, French defense contractors like Thales and Dassault Aviation, the very companies Macron relies on for his strategic autonomy, found themselves locked out of vital American-made AI components necessary for their Rafale fighter jets. The irony is agonizing. Macron's push for military independence was just crushed by his reliance on American supply chains. The domestic fallout inside France has been catastrophic, with major banks freezing corporate credit lines out of sheer panic. Thousands of French small and medium-sized enterprises cannot process payroll. The militant CGT union has already seized upon the chaos, calling for nationwide, indefinite strikes that have paralyzed the crucial ports of Le Havre and Marseille. Transport is grinding to a halt. French Finance Minister Antoine Armand has essentially vanished from the public eye, reportedly barricaded inside emergency meetings with the European Central Bank, burning through billions in emergency liquidity just to keep the ATM networks functioning. And where is the vaunted European solidarity Macron promised? It evaporated the moment Washington flexed its muscles. Macron desperately called Berlin, begging for a unified retaliatory EU countersanction. But German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, terrified that Trump would pivot and slap 150% tariffs on German automakers like BMW and Volkswagen, refused to take the call. Italy and Spain immediately backed away, leaving Paris completely isolated. What you are witnessing is a terrifying masterclass in 21st century asymmetric warfare. By weaponizing the dollar and dominating global tech supply chains, the Trump administration has proven that they don't need a military to break a superpower. They just need a pen. Macron's grand illusion of a defiant, untouchable France has shattered, exposing the brutal, unforgiving reality of American economic supremacy. So where does this leave Emmanuel Macron and the grand illusion of a united, autonomous Europe? The dust hasn't even begun to settle, but the geopolitical map of 2026 has already been violently redrawn. Washington has just proved to the world that ultimate hard power isn't only about aircraft carriers and stealth bombers anymore. It is about absolute control over the world's financial arteries and critical technology supply chains. Paris thought it was playing a sophisticated game of diplomatic chess, but the Trump administration just flipped the entire board. But this unprecedented escalation leaves us staring down a terrifying unknown. If the United States can completely paralyze a nuclear-armed G7 ally overnight without firing a single shot, who on this planet is truly safe? Is this the definitive end of the transatlantic alliance, or just a brutal public renegotiation of who is actually in charge? Can the European Union even survive this massive internal fracture now that Germany has openly abandoned France to save its own auto industry? And what happens to Emmanuel Macron? Will his government collapse under the crushing weight of domestic strikes and this engineered financial blockade? Or will this brutal wake-up call push Europe to finally and desperately build a non-dollar financial system before it's too late? We are witnessing global history unfold in real time, but the final verdict isn't written yet. And I want to hear from you. Was Washington completely justified in crushing Paris to enforce its America First global agenda? Or has the US just crossed a highly dangerous line that will ultimately destroy its own empire? Drop your political analysis in the comments below. This debate is just getting started. The shockwaves from this unprecedented financial strike are only just beginning to ripple beyond France, and the consequences could be far more explosive than anyone in Washington or Paris is prepared to admit. Because what looks like a targeted economic punishment may actually trigger a chain reaction that destabilizes the entire global financial system. Investors across Asia and the Middle East are already reassessing their exposure to US-controlled financial infrastructure. Quiet conversations are taking place behind closed doors in Beijing, Riyadh, and even New Delhi about one terrifying question. If France can be cut off this easily, who's next? Behind the scenes, emergency summits are being whispered about, not announced. Central banks are scrambling to reinforce currency reserves, while sovereign wealth funds are subtly shifting assets away from dollar-denominated instruments. This is how global financial realignment begins, not with a loud declaration, but with silent, strategic withdrawals. And the deeper fear gripping world leaders right now is not just about America's power, but about its willingness to use that power without hesitation, without warning, and without limits. Inside France, the political pressure on Macron is reaching a boiling point. Opposition parties are circling like sharks, accusing his administration of reckless arrogance and catastrophic miscalculation. Protests that initially began as economic demonstrations are rapidly transforming into something much more dangerous, an outright challenge to his leadership. Streets in Paris, Lyon, and Marseille are filling with angry citizens demanding accountability, while whispers of a no-confidence motion are growing louder within the National Assembly. The same leader who once positioned himself as Europe's strongest voice now finds himself politically cornered, fighting for survival on his own turf. At the same time, cracks within the European Union are widening into fractures. The illusion of unity has been shattered in real time. Eastern European nations, already wary of antagonizing Washington, are now openly distancing themselves from Macron's vision. Even traditionally aligned partners are choosing economic survival over political solidarity. The harsh reality has become impossible to ignore. When faced with the overwhelming force of US financial dominance, the EU is not acting as a unified bloc, it is acting as a collection of self-interested states. And then there's the military dimension, the one nobody is openly talking about yet. NATO officials are reportedly on edge, concerned that this economic confrontation could spill into defense cooperation. Trust, once broken at this level, is not easily repaired. If France begins to question the reliability of its closest ally, the long-term implications for Western security architecture could be profound. Strategic autonomy, once dismissed as political rhetoric, may now become an urgent necessity for Europe, but building that independence will take years, if not decades. Meanwhile, in Washington, this move is being framed not as aggression, but as enforcement. The message is clear and brutally simple. Defy American economic policy at your own risk. It's a doctrine that prioritizes dominance over diplomacy, leverage over negotiation. And while it may deliver short-term victories, it also plants the seeds of long-term resistance. Because history has shown that when global powers feel cornered, they don't just comply, they adapt, they innovate, and eventually push back. The most dangerous outcome here isn't immediate collapse, it's gradual fragmentation. A world where parallel financial systems begin to emerge. A world where the dominance of the dollar is no longer absolute, but contested. A world where alliances are no longer defined by shared values, but by strategic necessity. And if that shift truly begins here, in this moment, then what we are witnessing is not just a geopolitical clash between France and the United States, it is the early stages of a complete transformation of the global order. So the real question isn't just whether Macron can survive this crisis or whether France can recover from this economic shock. The real question is much bigger, much more consequential. Has the United States just secured its dominance for another generation, or has it just accelerated the rise of a world determined to break free from it? Because once that process begins, there is no going back.